Picture this. You're working the night shift on a desolate stretch of highway, your crew's machinery grinding against the asphalt when suddenly, through the diesel fumes and darkness, the haunting melody of a church organ cuts through the air like a knife through silence. But here's what makes your blood run cold. The nearest church has been abandoned for 20 years. Its congregation long since moved away after that unspeakable tragedy. Who plays music for the dead when the living have all gone? That's exactly what Mike and his road crew discovered on that foggy October night along Highway 47, when they heard something that shouldn't exist. A funeral rehearsal with no body, no mourners, and no organist anyone could see. The sound drew them like moths to flame, each note pulling them closer to a truth that would make them question everything they thought they knew about the line between our world and whatever lies beyond. The crew had been resurfacing that particular section of road for 3 nights straight, right where it curved past the old Hollow Ridge Methodist Church, its white steeple barely visible through the thick pine trees that seemed to lean in like they were keeping secrets. Local folks avoided talking about the church, changing the subject whenever outsiders asked why such a beautiful building sat empty, its stained glass windows dark as dead eyes. But on that third night, at exactly 2:47 a.m., when the fog rolled in thick enough to choke on, the organ began its mournful song, each chord resonating through the workers' bones, vibrating through the very ground beneath their feet. Mike tried to convince himself it was just the wind, maybe some trick of acoustics from their equipment. But when he killed the engines and the music continued, growing louder, more insistent, more alive than anything had a right to be in that forsaken place, he knew they'd stumbled onto something that had been waiting, rehearsing, preparing for guests who were never meant to leave. And if you want to hear more spine-chilling stories that'll keep you awake at night, make sure to subscribe to Fearway. Mike's hands trembled as he reached for his flashlight, the cold metal slipping in his sweaty grip while his crew gathered behind him, their breath visible in the frigid air that had descended like a burial shroud over the work site. And without a word, they began walking toward the church, their boots crunching on loose gravel that sounded like bones breaking in the stillness, each step taking them closer to that impossible music that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, growing richer, more complex, as if whatever was playing knew it had an audience now. The fog parted before them like curtains drawing back on a stage they weren't meant to see, revealing the church's weathered doors standing slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness between them that seemed to breathe, exhaling cold air that smelled of old roses and embalming fluid. And Tommy, the youngest of the crew, whispered that his grandmother used to say that smell meant the dead were restless. But Mike pressed forward, pushing the door open with a creak that harmonized sickeningly with the organ's melody. Inside, the church was exactly as it had been left 2 decades ago. Dust motes dancing in shafts of moonlight that filtered through cracked, stained glass. Pews still arranged in perfect rows, as if waiting for a congregation that would never return. Prayer books open to hymns no one would ever sing again. And there at the front, the massive pipe organ dominated the sanctuary, its brass pipes reaching toward heaven like desperate fingers. And the music, God, the music was coming from it. Keys depressing on their own in an intricate pattern that no human hands could manage. Playing a dirge that Mike recognized from his own father's funeral, but twisted, wrong, as if filtered through centuries of grief. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees as they approached the altar, frost forming on the wooden pews despite it being October. And that's when they saw the programs scattered on the front row, fresh and crisp as if just printed, each one bearing today's date and a name none of them recognized. Memorial service for Sarah Chen, beloved daughter, 1987-2024. But Sarah Chen had died in 1987. Mike knew because he'd gone to school with her. Remembered the car accident that had taken her life on this very stretch of highway. And now here was her funeral program, 37 years late, waiting for mourners who existed somewhere between memory and madness. The organ's volume swelled, rattling the stained glass in their frames, and shadows began to gather in the corners of the sanctuary, not cast by any light source, but seeming to emerge from the walls themselves, taking shapes that almost looked human if you didn't look directly at them. And Jenkins, the crew foreman, grabbed Mike's shoulder, hissing that they needed to leave now. But as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, trapping them inside with the music that was no longer just playing but calling, summoning, preparing. And Mike understood with horrible clarity that this wasn't a rehearsal at all, but an invitation. And they were the guests of honor at a ceremony that had been waiting 37 years to begin. The organ keys began moving faster now, fingers of shadow pressing them down in impossible combinations that created harmonies that shouldn't exist in any earthly instrument. And Mike watched in horror as the air above the keys shimmered like heat waves despite the freezing temperature, revealing glimpses of translucent hands, delicate and feminine, playing with the practiced grace of someone who had performed this piece 1,000 times before. And when he looked closer, he could see her, Sarah Chen, or what remained of her, sitting at the organ bench in the same dress she'd been buried in. Her face both 17 and ancient, beautiful and decayed, existing in two states at once, like she was caught between what was and what should have been. The crew huddled together as more shapes materialized in the pews, ghostly congregants filing in through walls rather than doors, each one bearing the wounds that had brought them to this place, some with steering wheels embedded in their chests, others with glass shards creating halos of reflected moonlight around their heads, all victims of Highway 47's bloodthirsty curve that had claimed 43 lives since the church was built in 1952. And they were taking their seats with the patient dignity of those who had waited decades for this moment, their hollow eyes fixed on the altar where something was beginning to form. A coffin materialized slowly, starting as mere suggestion of wood grain in the air, solidifying into polished mahogany that gleamed with an inner light. And Mike realized with sickening certainty that it was empty, waiting, and the temperature in his chest told him it might be meant for one of them. That maybe the road didn't just take lives randomly, but selected them, called them here to complete some cosmic transaction that had been interrupted all those years ago when the church was abandoned after Sarah's death. The first of many dominoes that had been falling ever since, creating a pattern only the dead could see. Tommy started praying, his voice barely a whisper, as the ghostly congregation turned their heads in unison to look at the living men. Their faces neither welcoming nor hostile, but expectant, as if waiting for them to take their places in a ceremony that transcended the boundaries between life and death. And Jenkins was backing toward the door, his hand frantically working the handle that wouldn't budge. While outside, through the windows, they could see their road equipment sitting abandoned, the warning lights still flashing but looking impossibly distant. Like viewing another world through frosted glass, and the organ music shifted, becoming a processional, a wedding march played in a minor key that suggested not union but separation, not beginning but ending. The shadow of Sarah Chen rose from the organ bench, her movements fluid as smoke, and she glided toward them, her feet never quite touching the floor, her mouth opening to speak or sing or scream. But what emerged was the sound of tires screeching, metal crushing, glass shattering, the symphony of every accident that had ever happened on that cursed stretch of road, playing out in perfect chronological order. And Mike understood that the church wasn't abandoned at all, but had become a repository for all those interrupted journeys, those unfinished stories, those souls who couldn't move on because the road itself had become a kind of purgatory, endlessly rehearsing the moment of impact, waiting for witnesses to validate their existence, to acknowledge that they had lived, had mattered, had left something behind besides skid marks on asphalt. Mike's legs wouldn't move as Sarah's translucent form reached toward him, her fingers passing through his chest and wrapping around something deeper than flesh, something that felt like the very essence of his being. And suddenly, he was seeing through her eyes, experiencing her last moments on that rain-slicked curve 20 years ago, the headlights swinging wildly as the car hydroplaned, the tree approaching with terrible inevitability, the moment of impact stretching into infinity. And he understood that every soul in this church was trapped in their own eternal instant of transition, forever rehearsing the crossing from one state to another, never quite completing the journey. The empty coffin at the altar began to glow with a soft, inviting light. And Mike heard his own voice, though his lips weren't moving, reciting names and dates, calculating the statistical probability of survival for anyone who worked this stretch of road long enough. And he realized the highway itself was alive, hungry, patient, feeding on the fear and flesh of travelers, using the church as a kind of digestive system where souls were processed, sorted, cataloged, and either released or retained based on criteria no living person could comprehend. Tommy collapsed to his knees, blood trickling from his nose as the psychic pressure of dozens of trapped souls pressed against his mind, each one trying to tell their story simultaneously, creating a cacophony of last words, final prayers, desperate pleas for one more minute, one more breath, one more chance to say goodbye. And Jenkins had given up on the door, instead pressing himself against the wall, trying to become invisible as the ghostly congregation began to stand, their movements synchronized like a choreographed dance of the damned. The organ music crescendoed into something that wasn't quite music anymore, but rather the sound of reality tearing. And through the rip, Mike could see the road as it truly was. Not asphalt and the painted lines, but a river of souls flowing in both directions. Some heading toward whatever came next, others circling back, caught in eddies and whirlpools centered on places like this church. And he understood that their road work, their constant resurfacing and repair, was actually disturbing something ancient, something that had made a bargain with the land itself long before the first settlers arrived. Sarah's ghost leaned close enough that Mike could smell funeral flowers and formaldehyde. And she whispered in a voice like grinding gears that they had three choices: join the congregation permanently, leave and never speak of what they'd seen, or complete the ritual that had been interrupted 20 years ago when the church was abandoned. A ritual that required living witnesses to acknowledge the dead, to speak their names aloud, to give them permission to finally let go. And as Mike looked at his terrified crew, at the expectant faces of the dead, at the empty coffin that seemed to pulse with possibility, he realized that some roads don't just connect places, but worlds. And Highway 47 had been trying to tell its story through blood and metal for decades, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to listen, to understand that the real horror wasn't in dying, but in being forgotten, erased, reduced to nothing more than a statistic in a traffic report. And as the church bell began to toll, counting down to a moment of truth that would determine whether they left as witnesses or stayed as congregants. Mike made his choice. Mike stepped forward, his work boots echoing against the worn wooden floor, and began to speak the names that appeared in his mind like burning letters. Each one a person who had died on Highway 47. And with every name spoken aloud, a figure in the congregation became more solid, more real, their features sharpening from ghostly blur to human clarity. Tears of release streaming down faces that hadn't felt emotion in years or decades. And Sarah's grip on his soul loosened as she whispered, "Thank you," in a voice that finally sounded human again. The organ music shifted from its funeral dirge to something almost hopeful. Notes climbing toward resolution as Tommy and Jenkins joined Mike in the recitation, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to unlock chains invisible to living eyes. And the empty coffin at the altar began to fill with light so pure it hurt to look at directly. A doorway opening not to death, but to whatever came after the endless rehearsal. One by one, the spirits began to walk toward the light, their forms dissolving into something beautiful and terrible. And Mike saw in their faces not fear, but relief. The kind of peace that comes from finally being allowed to stop running, stop rehearsing, stop existing in that liminal space between heartbeats. And the church itself seemed to exhale, its walls settling with sounds like sighs as the weight of 20 years of trapped souls lifted. But not everyone moved toward the light. A handful of spirits remained seated, their eyes black holes of hunger. And Mike understood these were the ones who had made the bargain, who had traded their chance at peace for the promise of power over this stretch of road, feeding on fear and blood to maintain their grip on the physical world. And their leader, an old preacher whose collar was stained with something that might have been blood or might have been shadow, stood and pointed at Mike with fingers that stretched impossibly long. The preacher's voice was the sound of tires screaming on wet asphalt as he explained that someone always had to stay, someone always had to tend the road, to manage the intersection between worlds. And since Mike had opened the door, had spoken the names, had completed the ritual, the responsibility now fell to him, unless he could convince one of his crew to take his place. And Mike felt the terrible weight of that choice pressing down on him like tons of fresh asphalt. Jenkins was already backing toward the door, which now stood open, moonlight streaming in to reveal that dawn was still hours away. Time moving differently inside the church than out. And Tommy was shaking his head, mumbling prayers his grandmother had taught him. But Mike looked at the remaining spirits, at the preacher with his hollow eyes, at the empty coffin that waited like an open mouth, and made a different choice. Speaking not the names of the dead, but the name of the road itself, Highway 47. Acknowledging it as a living thing deserving of rest, of release from its burden of blood. And the church began to shake as something fundamental shifted, the preacher's face contorting in rage and fear as he realized what Mike had done. That by naming the road, by giving it identity and agency, he had broken the original bargain, freed not just the trapped souls, but the land itself from its cursed obligation to feed on travelers. And as the church began to collapse, not violently but gently, like a tired body finally allowed to sleep, Mike grabbed his crew and ran. They burst through the church doors into the cold October night, the fog parting around them like water as they ran. And behind them came the sound of wood settling into earth, stone crumbling to dust, the entire structure of Hollow Ridge Methodist folding in on itself with a grace that defied physics, becoming not rubble, but something else, something that looked almost peaceful in the moonlight. like the earth had simply decided to reclaim what had always belonged to it. Mike turned back to see the preacher standing in the ruins, his form flickering between solid and shadow, his mouth opening in a scream that made no sound because his power, his hold on this world, was dissolving with the church itself. And then he was gone, pulled down into whatever darkness had birthed him, leaving only the faint smell of old hymn books and funeral flowers. The road beneath their feet began to change too, the asphalt softening, warming, as if blood was finally flowing through dead veins. And Mike watched in amazement as cracks sealed themselves, potholes filled, the entire surface of Highway 47 healing like skin knitting back together, becoming whole for the first time in 20 years. Jenkins was on his knees, gasping, checking his phone to find that only minutes had passed in the real world, though they'd been in that church for what felt like hours. And Tommy was staring at his hands, which still glowed faintly with the light from the coffin, a reminder that they'd touched something beyond understanding. The fog began to lift, revealing a sight that made them all stop breathing. Where the church had stood, there was now a simple memorial garden, headstones arranged in neat rows, each one bearing a name Mike had spoken. And at the center, a new stone that read, "Here lies the Hollow Ridge congregation, finally at rest, October 2024. As if reality itself had rewritten history to acknowledge what had happened. Their equipment sat untouched on the road, the other crew members still working, completely unaware that anything had happened. Time having folded around the three of them like a protective bubble. And when Mike tried to explain, the words died in his throat, because how could you describe the weight of souls, the taste of otherworldly music, the feeling of being chosen to break a curse that had fed on travelers' fear for 2 decades? But the road knew. Highway 47 remembered everything. And as they packed up their equipment at dawn, Mike felt it beneath his feet, no longer hungry, no longer waiting, just a road again, just asphalt and paint and the promise of destinations. And he understood that some battles against darkness are won not with violence, but with acknowledgement, with a simple act of calling things by their true names. The sun rose over the memorial garden, casting long shadows that looked nothing like reaching fingers. And birds began to sing where before there had only been silence. And Mike knew that every person who drove this stretch of road from now on would feel it too. Not the dread that had lived here for so long. Something else. A lightness. A sense that whatever had been wrong was finally, blessedly, eternally right. And that sometimes the dead don't need our fear. They just need us to remember their names. The crew never spoke about that night to anyone except each other, meeting once a year at a diner off Highway 47, where they'd order coffee they didn't drink and try to put into words what couldn't be explained. How Mike's hair had turned white at the temples. How Tommy still saw that golden light when he closed his eyes. How Jenkins had quit construction altogether and become a historian, obsessively documenting every forgotten church and abandoned cemetery in the state. The road itself became something of a legend among truckers and late-night travelers who reported an inexplicable sense of peace when driving that stretch. A feeling like being watched over rather than watched. And some swore they could hear faint organ music on foggy nights. Not the tortured dirge that Mike had heard, but something lighter, almost joyful, like a celebration of souls finally free. The state eventually widened Highway 47. And when they dug up the old asphalt, workers found something that made the local news, but was quickly explained away as a prank. Hundreds of old church programs buried beneath the road surface, each one dated October 2004. each one for a funeral that never happened, for a congregation that died waiting for salvation that never came. Mike kept one of those programs in his wallet until the day he died, peaceful in his sleep at 93. And his grandson found it there, yellowed and fragile, the names barely visible, but somehow still carrying weight, still holding the memory of that night when 3 road workers became unwitting priests, delivering a sermon of acknowledgement to souls who just needed someone to see them, to speak their names, to break the terrible rehearsal that had played on loop for 20 years in a church that existed between worlds, waiting for someone brave enough to attend the service that would finally, mercifully, let everyone go home.